All right, good morning, everyone. Christ is risen. Excellent. Well, it's really good to be here with you this morning. So my name is Lisi Schrottner. I'm one of the co-pastors here at Wildwood Mennonite Church. Welcome to you here in the sanctuary and those joining on the live stream as well. What a good morning it's been so far, the worship that we've experienced and the transformation that we've already experienced, turning this cross into a thing of beauty. So thank you all for participating. So I want to go through that story again in a bit of a different way. So imagine with me, the room is dark. Jesus' friends, grieving, tired, and scared, are huddled on the floor. They have been in mourning. In the silence of the Sabbath, in shared whispers in that dark room, they've been trying to make sense of the last few days. Jesus, their friend, their teacher, had been crucified and was laid to rest nearby. Life with him, life as they knew it, was over. They would no longer share that meal or share the path as they walked from town to town. They would no longer hear his gentle yet piercing voice telling stories of a kingdom that was here now but didn't look like anything they had expected. What were they to do? Now the Sabbath is over. In the early days of mourning, typically, the family of the dead stayed at home to grieve, leaving only to visit the tomb and grieve in the company of the dead and in the company of other mourners. Were Jesus' disciples, were they family? Was it okay to go visit? These ones who had left everything, had left their own kin to follow Jesus, and now their teacher and friend was gone. But before they decide to leave the dark room, they hear hurried footsteps coming up the stairs. Their friends, the woman who had been with them on the whole journey with Jesus, burst into the room. They smell of spices and ointments and excitement and wonder. They say, "He is not here, he is risen. Remember what he told us. Remember that he told us this would happen." Mary, Joanna, Susanna, Mary, and the others take turns excitedly sharing what they saw that morning. And after catching their collective breath, they turn to go back down the stairs and go into the world to share the good news. But the men don't follow. They stare and then shake their heads in collective disbelief. What idle tales, what nonsense. You see, these men are bound by a story that has an end, a story that was sealed up in the tomb 3 days ago. In the confines of the rock-hewn grave, their hopes were put to rest. The stories of that kingdom that Jesus told over and over and over were reduced to nothing more than tiny plot points in the webs of their imaginations. The connecting narrative had broken apart and was no more. It was buried underground. But then there's Peter. The swish of the woman's cloaks and the good news sparked something in his brain, and the threads of that narrative started to reconnect. Remember. And Peter remembered. He ran down the stairs, and when the woman veered left to the city streets, he veered right down the gravel path to the tomb. It was a sight of the linen strips folded neatly on the stone slab, the dust catching the morning light and dancing around him. This was no idle tale. The story was true, and it was not yet over. So Christ is risen. There you go. Christ is alive, and Christ collides with death. So as Denise mentioned, over the last 6 weeks of Lent, we've been journeying together towards the cross, towards Easter, telling stories of how Christ collides with our narratives and turns our world upside down, or right side up. Today, we recognize and celebrate Jesus' collision with death. The resurrection, this Jesus coming back to life, is a defining moment of the Christian story, and for some, it's the defining moment in all of human history. Whatever the scale of this event is, this Easter narrative collides with our own stories. It shapes us as individuals and as a community. For some, yes, it's an idle tale, and yet for some, this story rings true, and the story is not over. In fact, it's continuing on in our stories. Resurrection is a framework, a lens through which to view our lives, and it shapes how we see the world and our place in it. Resurrection is that thread which holds the pieces and individual stories of our lives together. It moves us along and ever closer to our understanding of who God is. This story, this space between the slabs of rock and the empty tomb, is a thin place where heaven meets earth. It's a place of transformation. Another way to say this is liminal space, a term I really appreciate. Liminal space is a threshold, quite literally from the Latin, between two realities. Liminal space is a space where change happens, where collisions happen. And that's what we have in this story here. Jesus has collided with death. Multiple realities, multiple stories colliding at once. And this is what the disciples are witnessing. Jesus' disciples are witness to the start of a new chapter in this never-ending story, entombed in the swirling and dancing dust in the morning light. When they come to the place where Jesus lay, the disciples, the devoted women, and then finally the men as well, are seeing the new thing that God is doing. Jesus' collision with death means new life for all of them, all of us. And now it's important to recognize that the new life does not mean that the things of the past are completely gone or completely forgotten. The resurrection and the collective memory of this grand event still bear the scars of what preceded it: the crucifixion of the Messiah, the extinguishing of the light of the world, when it seems the empire and the powers that be have won. The aches are still there. We hear these collective scars in the verses that follow our story in Luke chapter 24. On the road to Emmaus, two of Jesus' friends are trudging along the path, buried so deep within the scars of the crucifixion that they do not even recognize the resurrected Jesus in their midst, save for that kindling, that burning in their hearts. The aches are still there. So in this liminal space of the tomb on Resurrection Sunday and in the days afterward, when Jesus comes and goes and then is gone for good, change happens. At this point, this eternal story takes a turn and pushes forth with resurrected hope and renewed joy. So again, on this threshold between worlds, in this liminal space, what does the resurrection mean to us? What is the invitation as we step out of the cool darkness of the tomb and into the brilliant dancing sunlight? What scars and grief do we bear as we step forward? And how do we tend to those scars and grief in a way that honors their existence in our lives? Well, one of the words in this retelling of the resurrection in Luke's gospel that stood out to me was the word remember. The messengers say to the woman at the tomb in 24 verse 7, "Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and on the third day rise again." In verse 8, then they remembered his words. The disciples are invited to remember the things that Jesus told them before he was killed. Remember the things that he had done while walking on this earth. This remembering sets our roots in the past and what happened, the reality before. And it's the beginning of the story that they tell from this point on, the reality after and what happens next. The expansive realm of liminal space is where past and present and future collide. So in this space between worlds, on this Resurrection Sunday, how will we move forward? Well, at Easter, I come back time and again to this quote by author Cole Arthur Riley in her latest book, Black Liturgies. It only came out last year, so this is only the second year I'm using it for Easter, but it's become a tradition, and I plan to come back to it each year. So this is from her book, Black Liturgies. So she writes, "Easter holds memory for a God who came back to life still bearing scars. We're reminded that we don't have to leave behind our grief to participate in the joy of liberation. Our scars remain, but we don't need to dismiss our grief to participate in the joy of liberation." So these words capture the space, this liminal space that I've been in as I was preparing, and they capture the idea of the collision between these two realities, life and death. And they capture the Easter invitations I want to extend to you this morning. So the first part of this is to remember our scars. The liminal space of the resurrection, this reality of what was and is to come, is big enough to hold all of it, the good and the bad. Today we might feel like the disciples huddled in that dark room. We might feel like the woman at the tomb holding spices and ointments to embalm a body that's not there anymore. We might feel like those two disciples walking away from Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus, grief weighing down our steps. We might be hurting. We all bear the scarred image of the divine, and today those wounds feel all too real and all too deep. And we are grieving. Perhaps we're grieving a recent diagnosis and sitting in the uncertainty of what happens next. Perhaps we're grieving the loss of a loved one. Some of us are grieving our financial insecurity and the reality of changing economies and looming recessions. Today we grieve the loss of relationships, those fractured by different opinions and lifestyles and values. The world is a hard place. And these realities that I've named, the diagnoses, losses, insecurities, these are things that are felt by all of us here in this room. You bear wounds and scars, literal and figurative, physical and emotional. And that's just in this room, in this space. What about the world around us? What about those spending another Easter weekend in fear for their lives? Refugees fleeing, being deported. Minority groups having their civil rights stripped away one by one. The earth, our beautiful planet, lashing out because of the burden of consumption is too much to bear. These wounds are all fresh and deep, and that lifeblood is pouring out with little being done to stop the flow. This is the reality of our world. So this might be sounding more like a Good Friday sermon or reflection, and I have to admit, I actually really like those days leading up to Resurrection Sunday. Maundy Thursday might be my favorite day of the so-called Holy Week, and Saturday has become a pretty important day in that bunch of days as well. You might think nothing happens on Saturday, and that's exactly it. Now, from the earliest days of Christianity, as we read in the New Testament, this is the day that Jesus traditionally descended to the dead, called the harrowing of hell, and proclaimed victory over death in hell. So we can't forget about that. But in the traditions I grew up in, we didn't really recognize that. Saturday was just another day as we wait for Resurrection Sunday. This day can be called Holy Saturday. It can be called Silent Saturday. It's that day between the worst news and the best news. It's a day to sit in the disorientation that comes with the loss, a diagnosis, insecurity, in the messiness of life as we wait for hope and resurrection. And as Jesuit author James Martin writes, most of us live in this space all the time anyway. Others call it the messy middle. So in my mind, this is absolutely an example of liminal space between two worlds. And I love that we get to sit in this space for a whole day. And I do recommend in future Easter weekends, take time on this Silent Saturday to pause, reflect, meditate, take vigil. Because today, in this cultural moment, more than ever, it feels so appropriate to sit here, to sit in the muck and mire and examine the fresh wounds of what is most painful in our lives right now. So on Wednesday, I was here at the church for the L'Arche prayer night, and it was, which is something they do on a monthly basis, but once a year they have a foot washing ritual ceremony, I guess, as well. And we were fortunate and privileged to take part in that with our friends at L'Arche. And I love this part of Holy Week. As I said, I love Maundy Thursday, this thinking back to John 13, where Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. There's this awkward repetition in the Greek of love, love. Jesus loved his disciples, and I love that. Jesus loved those who had walked with him, and then he gets down on the ground and washes his feet. And as Christians, we have the opportunity, we have that calling to do that as well. So doing that with our new friends at L'Arche, newish friends, I guess, at L'Arche, was a real honor to do that and to pray together, to sing together, This morning at the sunrise service, we had communion, and doing that, taking part in a meal together, is symbolic and it's important. So that was Wednesday evening, this beautiful experience with our friends at Larch, continuing to grow those connections. And then I went home that evening, and as I tend to do, opened my phone and went on social media, bad idea, and then to open it to a post from a friend. I've known this friend for about 15 years, and what he was posting just made my heart sink. He posted something about a developing story south of the border in the U.S. About a conversation around immigration, deportation, terrorists, all that. You might know the story that's kind of unfolding right now. And this friend posted something with some words that I really disagreed with. And I admit, I reacted and I sent him a text back and said, "What do you mean?" And then we started this texting conversation. And it wasn't that surprising. This friend had gone down a different path than I perhaps am comfortable with, that I agree with. But the more that we texted, the more that he sent back to me, my heart just kept sinking lower and lower, and I was getting so discouraged. He was just using some of the terms that more conservative groups, Christian groups, are using, and I thought, what is going on? So again, I reacted very strongly, and it wasn't just emotional. I could feel it in my body. I could feel myself tense up and just, in a sense, just shaking, because I thought, this is not okay. Something's going on here. I could feel it in my body. And I think in part, it was because of the dissonance between what I had just experienced at this prayer night and this interaction immediately following with this friend. Because here in this very sanctuary, right here, I experienced love and tenderness, friendship and selfless kneeling on the ground as a servant. And then on the other hand, shortly after, on this medium that is far from perfect, I understand that, I was bombarded with this rhetoric, rooted in fear and hate, parroting what the most powerful people in the world are saying right now, parroting the words that get them elected and reelected. So there was this collision here, and I'm grateful to Andy for pointing out that word. It was a collision of sorts of realities. And it shook me, and I've been sitting in that dissonance for a few days now, and it hurts. And I think a lot of us are feeling this right now, this collision of narratives and realities. And it's led me to think, what wounds and scars are people bearing that they cannot find healing for? What stories and tombs are people so entrapped in that they cannot find it in themselves to care for others? What griefs and grievances are they holding onto so tightly that their hands cannot be used for washing feet and healing, but only for punching down and defending and destroying? What scars are they bearing? So these are the questions I ask myself when I'm trying to make sense of what I'm hearing and reading in the news and in the words of my friends. And when I have the patience and the time to give myself, it's an attempt to root myself in grace and love for that other person. And God knows it's very hard some days. And I acknowledge that some wounds and some traumas do not heal. I understand that. And this all reminds me of my own scars and the open wounds and griefs that I bear. So can I acknowledge them and honor the hurt and trauma that exist, and yet move forward in this resurrection hope? So again, Easter holds memory for a God who came back to life still bearing scars. We're reminded that we don't have to leave behind our grief to participate in the joy of liberation. Our scars remain, but we don't need to dismiss our grief to participate in the joy of liberation. So again, we're invited to remember the scars and pain and honor them, as the disciples did. So many things in this world and in our lives are far from perfect, and not even thinking about perfection. So many things are not healthy, are not whole. So how do we participate in the joy of liberation? It is Easter after all. What is the good news that we are gathered around today? Well, my next invitation, in the liminal space of the resurrection, we remember that we bear the image of the scarred divine. In our being and in our doing, we are called to embody the divine and live our lives in the same way. John 13:34 is one of the defining verses of Maundy Thursday Reflections, and it's this. Jesus says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." Just as Jesus lowered himself to wash his disciples' feet, broke bread, and broke his body in solidarity with an aching and oppressed world, so should we. Just as Jesus lived and moved in this world with compassion and, dare I say, empathy. Just as Jesus proclaimed the beloved community, just as Jesus reminded us all of the original goodness in the garden of creation, so should we. There are stories all along of God working throughout history since that garden, since Jesus' sojourn in first century Palestine, and all the stories in between and since them. Stories of ordinary people bringing about the beloved community. These are the stories of our ancestors, and these are the stories we call to mind and remember. And what is the connecting thread in this marvelous tapestry of stories? It's resurrection, hope, and participation in the joy of liberation. What connects us is the belief that something more is possible, that a beautiful and renewed world is possible, that freedom is possible. So the reality of the resurrection, whether it feels more like an idle tale or it's a reality that one stakes their very soul on, is that we've been given a calling, a responsibility to join in this work with God. With the woman at the tomb as the example and as our guides, we see, we remember, and then we proclaim that Jesus is alive. This good news has implications for how we live. As we bear the image of the scarred divine, we bring this good news to the world. And how do we do it? Well, this Easter, in this liminal space and this collision of realities and narratives, may we have the courage to live this good news. May we have the courage to live a life that mirrors the heart of God. Just as Christ lived in solidarity with the oppressed and offered his body to be killed, to be lynched on their behalf, may we do likewise. Just as Christ collided with the forces of evil, may we do likewise. May we have the courage to see our scars and wounds of the world, our own scars and the wounds of the world, and heal them and bind them with love and hope. May we forgive as God forgives and seek reconciliation always. May we find freedom in the liminality to let our imagination and creativity take over and shape us. May we expand our view of God and the church. May we blow wide open the definitions that have bound us and kept us trapped within the limits of our narrow worlds. And may we respond to others with compassion and empathy. May we participate in the joy of liberation and be bringers of that liberation. This is the gospel, and may we preach it today. May we align ourselves with the liberating good news and lift up the voices that have been silenced. In God's kingdom, in the renewal of the resurrection, barriers have been shattered and all are welcome. As we read in Colossians 3, a word for the church that bears that scarred image of the self-giving divine. So since you are raised with Christ and as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. I'd like to end with a poem here. This is a painting by Indian artist Frank Thomas called Lily Resurrection. So from among the shadows and whispers emerges a light and a shout. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Where there was death, now life. Where there was fear, now hope. Where there was silence, now waves of sound and color, covering the earth with reverberating tones of life and a love that knows no bounds. A love that calls us each by name and calls us beloved. We have heard and seen the Lord, for Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Let us rise with him now. Amen.